we're recording.
Okay, we're recording. Great. Okay, so um, we kicked off the day with a lecture by Tony Janettos, who, as it turns out, was Bill Paulberg's friend in high school. But he's currently the professor of the future at BU. And I very intentionally kicked the whole thing off with him because he does nothing but teach people how to think about the future. And it was a fascinating, some sort of the most interesting thing of the whole thing. I think we were all, by the end, we were very tired of measurement, but his words were really kind of hanging in the air, because he pointed out that, most people think about the future in terms of next year, or the year after. It's assuming that's not too different from the way things are now, but let's think about things a little bit farther. Today, many more people are thinking, okay, there's this black swan concept, which is something's going to come along and change us. And whether it's the cloud or Uber or B&B, or in our case, it happened to me back in the 90s when semantic analysis and natural language processing came in and basically, took 30 jobs away. And it took us a while to recover. Interestingly enough, the lesson there is the fact that many of those jobs now are called data analysts, because that's essentially what you need to make sense of all the data that the NLP's processes are doing. But and then there's the sort of intellectual discipline that where you really have to take a big step even farther back and say, what are the processes that shape the world or your world, and use that to create different scenarios of change that basically either are unbounded in terms of, you have no restrictions. In our world, it's probably bounded with some direction. He pointed out that, most of us do think about the future, but we just kind of do it as part of the day-to-day process, right? How do you save for college? There are all these issues that you take into consideration, especially with, if you've got, never having had children, I don't know these things, but basically, if you're starting to save for college when your kid is, say, 8, and you don't really know the nature and the size of the problem, like, how many children you're going to have and how many years are they going to go to college and what kind of colleges they're going to go to. And ultimately is the goal, 4 years or 1 year or part support or whatever. Can you afford to send the second kid? There's all these questions, that you just kind of do. You solve these problems all the time without really being able to predict the precise future, because you know how to think about them. That's the gradualist sort of approach. The bigger issue is what if you don't know how to think about them? And the way he teaches people to think about them is if you suggest that, let's assume that there's 1 in 100 chance of an unacceptable outcome, right? Some disaster of some sort happening every year, right? So the 1 in 100 year flood. Over 30 years, what is the chance of that outcome actually occurring, right? And there's a 0.73 chance that it never occurs. But what happens if, which basically says you got a 27% chance of it's going to happen at least once. But if you shrink your time frame down to 50 years, now you're up to a 40% chance. And basically he uses this as an example of, 40 years or 50 years, 40% chance of risk. That's really what you're seeing now in terms of climate change. And his example throughout his whole thing was climate change. But if you think about climate change, the 100-year hurricanes or the 100-year floods really are happening once every 50 years. So you don't know how to think about that. And that's one of the reasons why we're in the trouble we are. We really don't know how to think about this stuff. And so as we're thinking about the future of measurement, there's kind of the two-level approach, which is, okay, what tools and technologies are going to be around next year? But what came out of last week was really a discussion of the tools and techniques that we have evolving to a much more robust level, and what tools are we going to need? And the answers were kind of interesting. Let me get rid of this. Why isn't this going forward? Okay. And Tony's thing was, you know, how do you adapt to all this stuff? You react to things that are already occurring. That's pretty much what most of us do, you know, Sandy and Katrina, and so you harden your coastal defenses. You don't think kind of the way the Dutch do, which is, how about if we just let the water come in, deal with it as a natural occurrence, and figuring those things out? You know, nobody's really been thinking about the wildfires as an impact of climate change. And basically, all they're really doing is saying, you know, clear out your land a little bit farther up. That's not really, that's anticipating something you already know occurring, as opposed to anticipating change. And by shifting your baselines, by changing your tolerance for risk, sort of thinking about your risk tolerance and risk management. And that came up again and again. Risk became a huge deal over the course of the summit. So then we had Michael Ziviani and Forrest Anderson, who have been working on this massive project with probably 50 different, very senior level corporate communications people, talking about really the role that communications currently plays and will be playing in the organizations of the future. They have been talking to people all over the world. I think they've interviewed about 250 people or gotten input from 250 people. And what they started out doing was to say, is there a standard way to a standard framework for measurement, right? So if you have all of the communications in the world, is there a standard way that people approach measurement? And the answer is there really isn't. But they did come up with several themes from all of this. One is that senior leadership looks at planning as putting together a communications strategic plan with measurement in it. It's really much more a function of alignment, to align what's going on in the company, to feedback what they know about stakeholder intelligence. The theme 2 is that communications functions as everything from a facilitator through to advisor. 80 to 90% are operating at a technician level, which was kind of depressing for all of us, because we keep thinking of ourselves as it'd be nice to be managers and advisors. But that doesn't seem to necessarily be happening as much as we'd like it to be. But more so as even with all the technical stuff that we do and the tactical stuff that we do, we're also functioning as internal consultants, helping align the communications with the business strategy and sort of merchandising the success of communications. Fourth is research, which is obviously, you know, great news for all of us research geeks that love this stuff. But in a data-driven world, you have to have a culture that accepts research. It's communications functions to put that data into context. We can't, and this is something that anybody who read Beth and my book knows that, you know, it's a big theme. You can't just throw data over the cubicle wall, right? You really, as a communicator, you really have to put it in context. And I find that that's the trap that we all get into way too often. You know, we get into, here's the chart that we've been presenting every month or every quarter or whatever. And our job is to either explain why the chart goes up or the chart goes down. that's not terribly useful, nor is it in the context other than, it went up because we spent $50,000 more. We need to go beyond that to really put it into the context of how the business makes money. And then this is, again, a recurring theme of the summit, which is senior managers care about threats and opportunities. And communications needs to be thinking more about those bigger picture, longer term risks and opportunities. And I thought one of the more interesting things is that, they found that traditional communication metrics are useful to comm staff, but not to senior leadership. And what CEO and boards do not care about traditional communications metrics because they don't convey what communications is achieving as a business. And I heard that over and over and over again at PRSA as well. So I thought that was a very, that sort of confirmed my theory that if we're not talking about our contribution to business, we're probably, off the table there. And what they were arguing was that people in these senior levels feel that research is a way to open the door to talk to senior level people, to the brand managers. We can't go in there and talk about likes and creative. We have to go in there and talk about business results. And that opens the door by talking about opportunities and threats and risks, opens the door to talk to the CEOs and the boards of directors. So that was the standards update. We then heard from Southwest and Cisco about how they are currently using research, and I extracted a few of the slides. This is Kim Bowler from Southwest. They use an integrated dashboard, which I will confess I designed for them, that looks at internal communications as well as external, looks at, they have a very robust system of attribution where anything that goes to the website and results in a sale has a tag on it, and that revenue tag is attributed to the creating department. So they were one of the first people to do that, but they also integrate very closely with many of the outcome measures that HR and internal comms uses, as well as data throughout the organization. And so the first one was, we've all heard the story about United. Well, the interesting thing was, nobody was paying much attention. A, it was United. B, it was, it just wasn't on anybody's radar. Again, not thinking far enough in the future necessarily, until they do monitor the competition. And obviously the United mentions went off the charts. And then they started seeing references to Southwest in the context of that coverage, what we call a spillover. It became a spillover crisis where all the other airlines became affected. And then obviously if there's it had implications, so they were prepared when down the road, a couple weeks ago, whenever, they did in fact remove a passenger. They were prepared for sort of what to say and whatever, having learned from the data that they analyzed about United Airlines. In this, they were tracking both news and social mentions, and then they were tracking the social conversations to figure out what people got upset about, right? So obviously United was what was upsetting, but was it the fact that the cops were involved? Was it effect of the person? What was really going on? So they were using all of the tools that they have to understand what was going on out there, and frankly learned a lot from that episode that they could then apply to their own situation. On top of that, they also look at, you can see this long-term crisis comparison in terms of news volume and social volume, and they match that up with the chart here on the right, which is their ongoing monthly rep track pulse scores. There's a subscriber to the Reputation Institute's rep track, which a lot of organizations do, and so they keep track of that, and they know, the decline that you can see in May came directly from that United episode, that all airlines were affected by that United thing, because it raised the issue of not just dragging somebody off the plane, but overbooking. And so that became a very big issue in the industry that they were prepared for, because they had all of this data out there. Her key takeaways were that they've got quantities of data. Trust me, I've seen their data. There's so many data streams that, it keeps you up at night. But her point is human analysis is a critical component. And she was actually hired after we designed that dashboard that brought in all this data in. She was the one who was hired basically to analyze it and get insight out of it. And she's not the only one. I know a lot of people, anybody knows anybody who's looking for jobs. There's a lot of companies hiring people specifically to get insight out of communications data these days. Philip, if you've got students, have them talk to me. I have 2 or 3 clients that are really looking specifically for those hires. Whether it is big data or small data, right? Big data as in 50,000 social media posts, or small data in terms of individual reporters and the traditional external media stuff, it's always helpful in a crisis. But it's not terribly useful if it doesn't tell the story. We've heard this, everybody was talking about storytelling, but the point here is the fact that your metrics have to tell the story so that you can get people to change their beliefs or opinions about what it is that you're doing. If you think about the communications purposes to change, opinions or behaviors or beliefs, we have to practice that same thing as we try to explain what our results are telling us. And just because you didn't start the crisis doesn't mean you won't become involved. Basically use the data you've got to prepare accordingly. It's one of the things where you've heard me before say, no more pie charts, because that doesn't tell you the long-term history of things. But if you have that history, use it to say, okay, maybe, passengers getting dragged off of airplanes is a worse crisis, but let's talk about the other bad crisis. Let's talk about these other crises, what worked and what didn't work. And all of that data gets fed into the next round of decision making. We also heard from Elizabeth Rector at Cisco on how she uses data and dashboards. Now, Elizabeth and I have worked together. I was actually one of the ones who was adding insight at one point, designing their original dashboard way back when. She has since moved on and uses a whole variety of tools to get the information out. But she's basically got long-term data on both media as well as perceptions, right? So what they're using is they're using CIO customer surveys to identify issues among their customers, the chief information officers, but then they also go in and use aggregated natural language processing to analyze social and traditional media to figure out what's being talked about as well as what they're reporting. And it turns out that security right now is the hot topic, right? So that among their customers is the number one priority. That obviously informs how they talk, what and how they talk about. 1/4 of the responses said security was a high priority. And then in terms of how they talked about it, they found that CIOs spoke of security in terms of overarching, the overarching concern about security rather than I'm going to buy this data defender so that I can do this, right? They're talking about it as a much bigger concept. So the lesson there is, get into the minds of the CIOs and talk to them in the way that they're thinking about security, not the way you want to think about security because you got a product to solve, but meet them on their terms to talk about security in terms of all of the impacts from, external hacks to internal leaks to all the data breaches and everything else. And then this I thought was fascinating. They use a product called Quid to analyze their data analytics, to boil down the conversations out there that are going on and into groups. So they group them according to certain things relative to security. And I love the visualization of this, so ransomware and malware threats are number one, emerging, but IoT and security is there. Revamping security portfolios to meet growing demands is the biggest, but not emerging. That's always been there. And then innovative approaches, solutions. 19% of the conversations revolved around that. And then the evolving threat of data breaches and cyber attacks, as well as acquisitions and dissolutions. So it tells them, it really informs them as to how they're going to position the conversation about security, because obviously they're a big player in that industry. But again, they need to shape the conversation. They are using their data from traditional social media to identify how conversations should evolve. And they do influencer security share of voice as a way of saying, okay, how are we doing? This is, what's the percent change? What's the quarter-over-quarter change? Because they want to be known as the leader in it. So this is a key metric for them, and the key performance indicator for them to know that, yes, they are, in fact, still on top. Key takeaways. Again and again, we heard this, right? Communications professionals need to have a thorough understanding of the business. They need to align with the business and make sure that the business buys into the metrics and integrate with other business metrics. Metrics needs a closed loop process to make sure that actions are being taken. This is a very frustrating thing from my end. I design all these dashboards. I never know. I never get any feedback as to whether they've actually impacted behavior. But I think that's a big problem with communications. Again, we tend to throw reports out there. We don't tend to follow up and find out, are behaviors actually changing? And that communications professionals really need to rely on data and metrics to drive strategy. And that's her take from, I think, doing this for at least 15 years of doing metrics at Cisco. Mark Whitney has about as much, actually at least that longevity at Exeter Health Resources, Exeter Hospital. Through Confessions, I'm on the board. I work with this guy every day. I was honored to have him in my living room because he's wicked smart. And he started out as a strategy guy. Strategy in the health industry today, especially in healthcare, is a pretty demanding job, but he's basically he was the one who just revamped the board packets that I had to see so I could actually make sense of them and get some aha moments out of them. But a few years ago, he also took on development as well as communication. So it's now a gigantic strategy and advancement. And so basically, one of the ways they're looking to survive these challenging times these days is to beef up their development and their outreach to the community. It's a three-pronged business. At the hospital, core physicians is their physician network, and RVNA is their home and healthcare and hospice services. And as he said, this is the chart that keeps them all up at night, which is the fact that the classic healthcare model is in this period of decline. the new model is this risk-based business model where the hospitals and the healthcare providers have to be responsible for the health of their patients. Now, the good news is that, you know, the hospital has always had the charter of taking care of the health of the communities, but now they're actually being held financially responsible for that. And we're right there in that middle theme piece where, you know, they're not paid for the risk. They're not paid enough by the risk-based business model to really survive, but the fee-for-service model is being phased out. So it's a period of just basic uncertainty regarding whether anything is sustainable. They use data, right? So they survey the community on a regular basis to find out what it needs, not just in terms of, you know, do I need more knee doctors because it's an aging population, but listening to the community to say, what do we need? And it turns out that the last time they went out and did the community needs survey, the number one thing on everybody's list was suicide prevention. Well, that's not something a hospital had ever even thought about doing. But they've now got $1 million program devoted to figuring out solutions to the high rates of suicide in that community. They're constantly surveying population health so that they know that's their measure of success. They have to. The Department of Health, you know, Health and Human Services actually requires now that they are judged based on the population health, and the frequency and the number of things that are happening on. They're looking at the broad market data because obviously the competition is fierce, even though it's very regional. They do, and I'll show you an example of this. They do regular opinion surveys, reputation surveys. They do, again, because of the changing regulations, they are surveyed constantly on the quality, even though they may not always agree with the definitions of quality. Doesn't matter. That's part of the reality today. And all of these numbers are posted publicly. So anybody making a decision about what hospital to go to can look up their quality data as well as their satisfaction data. And then they also have to do regular employee surveys because obviously nurses and doctors are hard to come by, especially in a state where we've got 2.7% unemployment. Mark gave us example of how you respond to a public crisis, and we had two, we had two, one being the Anthem Health Insurance announced to the world that they were going to drop Exeter because they were too expensive. And they were using data that obviously the hospital didn't agree with, but it didn't matter. It was out there, and Anthem used the ranking that Portsmouth was one of the most expensive hospitals as a way of, A, justifying their dropping of them or threatening to drop them, and B, basically as a bargaining chip to get them to accept lower rate payments. And they won. The insurance company won, and they had to take a $10 million haircut on their rates. And it was devastating because it literally affected the number of people coming to Exeter Hospital. But they took that data, and this is all data from what you're seeing is people who have had experience with the hospital over the last 5 years, and within the last year, 2 to 5 years, 5 years or longer, or don't know. And it enabled them to identify that those people that were most likely. So if you look at the people within the last year, they're all pretty happy, right? Within the last 2 to 5 years, yeah, they're all still pretty happy. It's the 5 years or longer, or the people that don't know them, that are the most likely to change opinions. And those are the ones they were watching when there was another health safety issue with a guy who had been, who was hepatitis C positive, and he was a traveling tech worker, lab worker, and had gone around the country and inspected people with hepatitis C in 24 other hospitals. And it wasn't until he got to Exeter that 20 people in the emergency room came down with the ER. It came down with hepatitis C, and that was a big enough number to get everybody's attention. And so it was a huge national issue, but they had learned from prior data who they needed to reach out to, what they needed to do with the community to basically keep the damage under control. And so they look at market share data all the time. They look at reambition rates because that's another thing that they're looking at, but then they redesign based on all this data the services they offer, and obviously on marketing success. We talked about suicide prevention. And essentially, he's the one responsible for establishing, if you go back to how do you look at the future, he's the one who is always looking at the future, and he's using all of this data on a regular basis to figure out, to identify the population health, coordinate, look at the ability to predict it, engagement. And this is basically using consumer data to drive long-term relationships. That's pretty unusual for a hospital, and that's basically where they're at. It really is. It was a very interesting case study in terms of coordinating public health, and the fact that the healthcare consumer is changing so much. Right, so when they didn't have to pay for anything, they'd accept anything. Now, when everybody is so aware of out-of-pocket costs and co-pays and everything else, there's a huge shift in the marketplace, and that's what he's using all this data to deal with. This is a fascinating chart and totally derailed the conversation because, what makes us healthy, 50% of what makes us healthy is healthy behaviors. So what does the hospital and the health resources do? Medical services, which has the least impact on our overall health. So this has had a huge impact on how they think about the future. And these are his emerging priorities, pattern recognition. Actually, this is from a different one. Got my slides confused. So, and I'm going to sort of hurry through this last one because I know that people probably have questions and I want to leave time for that. But Proof is a system that basically takes data from PR, social media, marketing data, everything else, puts it into a very easily viewed easily used system that can then look at the correlations and do predictive analysis. It's kind of on the very forefront of marketing analytic tools. And it's been out for about a year now. It was invented by this guy, Mark Steuss. And what he's seen is, again, you'll see the emphasis from the point of view that communications doesn't care so much about this tool. It's being forced into organizations by the chief financial officer, chief risk officer, right? CMOs are so concerned today about keeping their jobs that they sort of want measurement, but they're not willing to commit to it to a long term because they're not going to be there, right? The jobs are going away, are changing regularly because people aren't feeling there's a regular survey and it always says, CEOs don't understand the value that marketing brings. Same thing with agencies. So what he's saying is that there are huge concerns in business end, the financial folks and the auditors and stuff about waste, fraud, economy, the economics of things, and the desire to understand the opportunity cost, right? What's the opportunity cost of doing something new? And so in terms of his work that he's doing, what he's found is that 2/3 of a lot of the technology out there is shelfware. Nobody ever really uses it. That technology solutions are far outstripping human capability and organizational capacity to do something about it. That data federation versus traditional data lakes, right? So silos that I've been, ranting about forever are still there. few logical frameworks for any of this stuff. Speed to insight, speed to value is a big priority. And brand damage is used to understand the analytics, to put the analytics into context. But the concept of communication centers of excellence or measurement centers of excellence apparently isn't working very much, as you said. So this is what, again, these are his conclusions after a year of being in the marketplace: failure to demonstrate how brand reputation monetizes intelligence and insights, to prioritize intelligence and insights over just the activities still happening. Failure to basically effectively measure the awareness, confidence, and trust psychographics. Failure to accurately understand how different parts of the PESO model are consumed by consumers and how it's used in the process of decision making. For the business, it's failure to insist that communications and marketing teams fund instrumentation analytics before funding activities or campaigns. This is his big thing, which is people tend to want to do things, to launch activities or campaigns rather than making sure that metrics are in place ahead of time. So the priority, interestingly, so incremental value creation, in other words, are you adding value to the system in one shape or form? Democratization in terms of everybody's got data. Pattern recognition versus actual predictive analytics. I mean, the problem with predictive analytics is the fact that, as we've been saying all along, prediction is hard, and it's really not something that a technology is going to produce. But you can look at pattern recognitions and make decisions from that. Priority analytics are just good enough to get the job done. They don't have to be perfect. Targeted use of AI in order to better understand what people are saying in terms of text analytics. Automation versus human is still, both need to exist, and soft factors. I can't remember what he said about that. It was end of a long day. Big shift in terms of businesses and boards of directors exercising more control over marketing, over risk management, over governance, looking at measuring reputation, measuring marketing spend, measuring all of that stuff in the context of risk and governance. Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, even, he's getting hired basically because Sarbanes-Oxley requires you to demonstrate value for shareholder dollars. Increase oversight from procurement, management of performance, moving away from centralized data and making it more dispersed in the organization, and pay for performance. So basically, paid and owned dominate revenue and revenue velocity, but earned and shared, i.e. the stuff that PR typically does, delivers the greatest impact on upsell and share of wallet. Everybody cheered at that one. Earned channel performance skews hard towards unique and very strong impact in mid to late stage of the buying process. Again, this is based on his own data. While paid and owned dominate the early stage, and shared channel performance reflects consistently low correlated impact. So the sharing does not impact business metrics, is basically what he's saying, which is interesting because I think a lot of us emphasize sharing as a key metric. Turns out it doesn't really have that much effect. And a lot of these things, so the interesting thing, United Airlines had a record, no matter all of the PR disaster out there, it didn't really skew their company performance at all. P2P, person-to-person, is true, but basically B2C and B2B skew differently in terms of risks. Risk. Seems to be a driving impact in terms of how people behave in terms of their purchasing. And I think I'm going to skip through this and wrap it up because I think That gives us at least 15 minutes to answer some questions.
All right, I've unmuted everybody. Marianne had to leave. I told her we'd get the recording, and Rebecca is still here.
Great, great. Any questions, Rebecca?
Hi, Paine. I've been a huge follower of yours. I don't at the time, but I am in a new position where I am revisiting all my notes from following you for so long to establish as strong a measurement dashboard as I can. So now I love seeing
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And lots more data on this coming. You'll see in my follow-up. I've got a little summary that I have to write up. Last week was a little busy between PRSA and the summit, so I'm a little behind in getting my write-up out there, but it will be in the next issue of the Measurement Summit and the Measurement Advisor, and in the follow-up email that you'll get within the next few days.
I need to be there in person, but I had a conflict.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. I'm having some feedback issues. Like,
oh, okay.
Can't see.
I said I would have given my ITs to Ben in person attending your recent summit, but I had a conflict.
Great. Excellent. It is the lobster was excellent, I have to say. The leaves didn't perform quite as much as we'd like them to be. In fact, today there was a story on the radio about the fact that it's a very slow, late foliage season in New Hampshire, because normally by this time we'd have much more color, and we did not have much. But it was very nice that we could walk around a lot, and it was excellent. But next year we might do it a little later. Anyway, yeah, the weather was good, so we could actually. What was fun was, Philip, you missed it. We did everything on the screened-in porch rather than a tent outside, so it was much warmer. Warmer and cozier.
Well, good. Well, I hope to be able to attend in person next year.
Absolutely, me too.
But thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. And thank you, Philip, for recording that and doing this. It's really been great.
Very good. I'll make sure I get this processed and get it to you as soon as I can.
Awesome. Thanks so much, and have a great day.
Take care.